Let's get started. And let's start with my introduction. My name is Josef Šíma, and I'm the one who you can blame for organizing this event, Prague Conference for Political Economy 2011. I'm delighted to welcome you all in this beautiful facility of CEVRO Institut, School of Legal and Social Studies, which I have the privilege to be the president of. CEVRO Institut is a small, elite, private college offering BA and MA programs in political science, private and public law, sociology, and economic policy. And the ultimate goal would be to have a small, multidisciplinary, and international PhD program on top of it. The school, however, has one more feature which makes it attractive and very special. This is a free market college, and very explicitly so. We want our students to seriously study classics in political philosophy and understand what role the old battle between classical liberal and socialist ideas has on the way economic and political problems are studied and debated. Simply, we want our students to read Locke, Smith, Hayek, Mises, Rothbard, and others to understand that ideas actually matter. PCPE, Prague Conference on Political Economy, therefore fits very well our school profile. It is organized since 2005 and has become a traditional annual meeting of scholars working in the tradition of the Austrian economics and Austrian-friendly fields of social research. Also, thanks to this conference, Prague became a Central European center of gravity for classical liberals and other free marketeers. Simply, I'm glad to welcome here all of you who understand that economics is not a fancy playground for artificial model builders, but a science which deals with real people acting in the real world. It is a very practical science whose understanding is crucial for social flourishing, and at the same time that you need to acknowledge that other sciences need to be seriously studied as well in order to understand what is really going on. As Ludwig von Mises stated on the very last page of his book, Human Action, the body of economic knowledge is the foundation upon which modern industrialism and all the moral, intellectual, technological, and therapeutical achievements of the last centuries have been built. It rests with men whether they will make the proper use of the rich treasure with which this knowledge provides them, or whether they will leave it unused. But if they fail to take the best advantage of it and disregard its teachings and warnings, they will not annul economics, they will stamp out society and the human race." End quote. I'm very happy that social scientists from all over the world, not just economists indeed, keep coming to this event. This year we have participants from 16 countries, which makes it a unique mix of scholars, distinguished full professors, younger assistant professors, PhD students, graduate students, think tank people, journalists, etc. All of them, by being here, helping us to pursue our goal, which is this. The conference is an attempt to revive the tradition of critical thinking, crossing boundaries of traditional disciplines, the tradition of broadly defined economics with its connection to law, political science, philosophy, and history. The tradition of Austrian economics and liberty-oriented thinking that thrived in Central Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, but sadly disappeared thereafter. For this reason, we set up 2 annual prizes called after 2 great scholars, Franz or František Cuhel and Friedrich von Wieser, whose lives are closely connected with the city of Prague. And this afternoon, the first day of our conference will be devoted to the legacy of these great men. Tomorrow's program will be much less of a celebration. We are having plenty of sessions on wonderful topics, and we expect insightful debates with your contributions, highlighting the lessons from your particular countries and your fields of interest. I personally and my team, by the way, wearing these pink badges, do our best to make your stay in Prague at CEVRO Institut as pleasant and memorable event as possible. Do not hesitate to approach us. In case of any problems you may possibly have. Our facility is here for you, ready to host this great conference. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we can move to the first part of the program, which is the announcement of Franz Cuhel Memorial Prize. Franz Cuhel was a Czech economist who had been a member of Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk's seminar in the years before World War I. His book, Zur Lehre von den Bedürfnissen, or On the Theory of Needs, is famous as a pioneering attempt at establishing the concept of ordinal rather than cardinal utility. This achievement was acknowledged by Ludwig von Mises in his great books and then brought through the work of Lionel Robbins into English-speaking economic world. For those who are interested in reading more about Cuhel or something by Cuhel himself, I recommend you to visit a website of the conference where you can find a link to a journal which is an offspring of this conference, New Perspectives on Political Economy, a scholarly journal of CEVRO Institut, where I hope you are also going to submit the best of your papers presented here during the conference. Now, it is my great pleasure to have here today Professor Peter Boettke as a recipient of 2011 Franz Cuhel Memorial Prize. Professor Peter Boettke is a professor of economics at George Mason University, the BB&T professor for the study of capitalism, vice president for research, and research director for the Global Prosperity Initiative at the Mercatus Center, and the deputy director of the James Buchanan Center for Political Economy. He is a leading figure of modern Austrian School of Economics in the US, and he is also responsible for educating and actually producing the whole new generation of Austrian scholars, younger professors, contributing substantially to refinement of Austrian pure and applied theories. In his writings, he does not only show how Austrian ideas penetrated the non-Austrian approaches, but more importantly, demonstrates how the influence runs in the opposite direction. The Austrian tradition has become, thanks to him, a school of thought whose modern formulation organically incorporates contributions of leading scholars in related economic disciplines, represented by names of Nobel Prize-winning economists such as James Buchanan, Ronald Coase, Vernon Smith, Thomas Schelling, Doug North, or Elinor Ostrom. Professor Boettke has authored numerous books on the history, collapse, and transition from socialism in the former Soviet Union, such as The Political Economy of Soviet Socialism, or Why Perestroika Failed, or Calculation and Coordination, Essays on Socialism and Transitional Political Economy. He is also the co-author, along with David Prichitko, of the classic Principles of Economics texts of Paul Haynes' The Economic Way of Thinking. He has edited, among other books, 9 volumes of Socialism and the Market, the Socialist Calculation Debate Revisited, 3 volumes of The Legacy of F.A. Hayek, 2 volumes of The Market Process. His most recent book, Challenging Institutional Analysis and Development, The Bloomington School, was published by Routledge in 2009. Since 1998, Professor Boettke has served as an editor of the Review of Austrian Economics. Now, Professor Boettke, please approach me to receive the PCPE 2011 Cuhel Memorial Prize for Excellence in Economic Education.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be here and to give this lecture at the Prague Conference. Franz Cuhel holds a honored place within the development of the Austrian pure theory of the Austrian School of Economics. As Professor Sima said, Ludwig von Mises credits Cuhel with first providing the first systematic presentation of strict ordinal utility analysis. And the reason why that's such an important deal is because the confusion in choice theory eventually led in economics to the purging of the human element in economics. So that the mistake that a lot of sciences made in the earlier period of time of trying to import human purposes and plans on physical phenomena, when that was done in the human sciences, we didn't get anthropomorphism, we got mechanomorphism. We ended up by treating human subjects as if they were machines. And this has a huge consequence, which is related to my title. My title actually is meant to sort of shock this audience, because Cuhel and the Austrians made an argument that the contributions of the Austrian school were strictly scientific. They were purely positive economics. And in fact, they were. When Gernot Mordal did his book on the political element in economic theory, he actually held out the Austrians as the one example of a school of thought that wasn't polluted by political ideology, that it was, in fact, just strictly scientific. And so one of the things that I want to try to say here is that while anarchism is going to invoke various different ideological imagery to you, I want to view it as an extension of a positive science. All right, that's going to be one of my challenges. My other challenge is that this audience is pretty sophisticated, so actually they would have seen these terms maybe together before. In fact, I know they have. There's going to be a session about this stuff tomorrow. And so, what is it that's still, what could be shocking if it's so familiar to you? Well, I think it's going to be the way that I'm going to try to talk to you about it is going to be shocking. My attempt is still to shock. Okay. So the structure of my paper is, goes as follows: an introduction, Then we're going to talk about the Soviet and post-Soviet context. And then rules and strangers, and what I mean by that. And then a plea for mechanism in the study of anarchism. And then I'm going to conclude with some remarks about the contemporary relevance of this research. My definition of anarchism in the paper is there are endogenous rules that result in situations where there's not a geographic monopoly on coercion. All right, so that's what I'm suggesting that we focus on. We're going to focus on situations where there's endogenous rule formation, so there's no legal centralism, and there's no recourse to a geographic monopoly on the means of coercion. Now, that could be because either there isn't a state, or the state that's in operation is completely ineffective. Because, note, my first example is going to come from the Soviet and post-Soviet context. Clearly, in the Soviet context, there was a state, right? But there was mechanisms outside, and I'm going to talk about the limits of that, what I do with that as well. All right, so let's start on my little adventure here. Here's how my argument goes. Where's Merrick? Raise your hand. There you are. By the way, Dr. Hudek here, he's the guy who wrote the nice little biography on Cuhel for your journal. So, and he just defended his dissertation the other day, so now he's joined the ranks of the lettered, whatever we call that, and so now he's joined the community. And part of this argument is in response to you, but part of it is to the broader audience as well. So why is it that we get so worked up about this positive contribution that Cuhel and Mises made about ordinal marginal utility analysis? And what I would like to suggest to the people in this room, since you're very dedicated students of Austrian economics, is that you go back again and you read the first 100 pages of Human Action, but don't concentrate on his methodological defense of methodological dualism or his defense of a priorism, but instead focus on why it is that he thinks human choosers have to have open-endedness of choice. Okay? And that's why the ordinal marginal utility is the tool for that, whereas the sort of maximizing, constrained optimization models that later on were developed by Hicksian analysis close that off. Because what they result in their logical conclusion is an institutionalist economics. Okay? In the most extreme form of this, Oscar Lange, for all of us, we need to remember is that Oscar Lange, in the height of the calculation debate, accused Ludwig von Mises of being an institutional economist. And by that, he didn't mean like the department that now, Professor Lipka heads up. Okay? What he meant by that was Mises hates institutionalists. Those are guys like Veblen. And Mises is just like them. And the reason is that economic laws must not be timeless if you can't calculate when there's no private property in the means of production. Right? That's what Lange is saying. And the reason is because prices are not, in Lange's model, are not connected to property. Later on, you'll hear from one of the great property rights economists in modern times later after me, and Terry Anderson. But one of the sort of real original property rights guy is a guy named G. Warren Nutter. And Warren Nutter, in his response to this stuff, actually wrote an essay called Markets Without Property Are as a Grand Illusion. Because the model of market socialism was in fact trying to do that, create a market but without any private property rights. And so the open-endedness of choice means that institutions can in fact in part or do their work on the individual. So we had a strong period in modern economics where we went through an institutionalist development. If you read a classical economist, like, say, J.B. Say, or Adam Smith, or Nassar Sr., Just pick them randomly off a shelf in a library. You will find in them, John Stuart Mill even, you will find in them public choice, right? Let me just stop to highlight this for a second. What is the greatest satire in the history of economics? It's Bastiat's petition, right? The candlestick makers are petitioning the government because there's unfair competition from the sun. That's Gordon Tullock. Concentrate the benefits, disperse the costs, right? That's rent-seeking, right? Those guys are, and he's laughing at it. He's making fun. That's why, it's like absurd, right? Well, that's what Tullock was doing when he was talking about the mohair subsidy, right? Or he's making fun of that. Economists have done that from the beginning. Why did we lose that? Why did you need to have Tullock resurrect Bastiat's petition in modern guise? Well, because in economics we lost this wisdom because we developed an institutionalist economics. Well, why did we have institutionalist economics? Because we didn't have individual human choosers. We had automatons. Okay? And so, read that first part of this book. Now, in intellectual history, what happened was there was a mad rush called the counter-revolution in economics to get institutions back. All right? In fact, this phrase about institutionalist economics, I'm not just making it up. Francis Bacon, who was one of the major developers of the theory of market failure, he actually described in his original paper on that our goal is to get an institutionally antiseptic theory. Right? His goal is to get an institutionally antiseptic theory. So, public choice, law and economics, organizational theory. In fact, one of the things that Professor Shima mentioned was all these different people that have now the influences coming back into Austrian economics. It's actually not really true in some sense, but it is in another fundamental sense. And what I mean by that is that if you read Mises and Hayek, they didn't lose the institutional emphasis. So Hayek wrote in law, he wrote about politics, right? And same thing with Mises. He's, praxeology is rational choice theory, but applied across all the disciplines of human life. So they had all of these things. They were similar to the 19th century classical economists. The reason why they became outside of favor was precisely because economics moved away from them. And a lot of these people that you mentioned, the Jim Buchanan, an Armin Alchin, a Jim Buchanan, a Ronald Coase, Doug North, Eleanor Ostrom, a large part of what they did was they pushed economics back in a direction closer to the kind of research program that Mises and Hayek were already developing, or their contemporaries in Germany, the ordo liberals, or, these kind of people. So they used to meet. Fascinating thing. They had meetings like this, but much smaller groups. There's a group called the Volcker Fund, and they used to bring people together to talk. And Armin Alchin wrote his paper, Some Economics of Property Rights, which he didn't publish for, I think, the folklore is something like 10 years because he didn't think the need to publish it. That was because he was the discussion leader on Mises's human action to a group of young economists that included Henry Manny, Jim Buchanan, Israel Kirzner, Harold Demsetz, name the group. And they all met and talked about these things, and he was the discussion leader, and in summarizing Mises's position, he wrote this thing called Some Economics of Property Rights. Henry Manny just told me this story last fall, and they all screamed at Alchin because they say, Armin, would you please publish this paper? And he's, of course, no, I'm going to golf, I'm not going to do that. And, as a result, he never published it, and then eventually it came out. They used to meet in the United States through the auspices of the Volcker Fund, but they used to meet over in Europe. Hayek organized these things, and Karl Brunner organized these meetings where they would get together with all European colleagues. And they were all going to develop the development of institutional economics, bring institutions back into economics. And Hans Albert warned them early on. He's a German sociologist, and he said, look, neoclassical economics will never be able to repair its institutional deficiency until it repairs its behavioral deficiency. If you have a closed-end close-ended model of individual choice, you're not going to be able to talk about the institutions the way you want to. You're going to have to open it up for the kind of analysis. This is something Doug North now is focusing on in the most recent book, not the one that's co-authored with Weingast and John Wallace, but the one before that called, I think it's called The Process of Economic Change. And the one before that, Institutional Change and Economic Performance, also has it. If you go back to Structure and Change, it's more traditional model of that. And so, if you see the way his evolution of his work is modeled on that, he's taken more and more into account this issue of the cognitive dimension, opening up of choice. Okay, so why does that matter? Because endogenous rules are an institution. See what I'm saying? So the Austrians that have the open-endedness of choice then also can talk about how it is that institutions can arise. They don't have to treat institutions just as given. Traditional economics treats institutions in this framework as fixed and given. One of my favorite economists is Armin Alchian. I think he's a brilliant economist. His book, University Economics, you should all go out and get and read. And if you can read that, you would do a lot of damage in the world by understanding how it is that economic processes work. This last year, the Nobel Prize was given to people who work on the economics of frictions. And Armin Alchian got there again way before the head of them on discussing the positive role of frictions in economics in a paper in 1969 on resource costs. Okay, so Alchian's just one of the best economists ever, and he's one of the developers of property rights economics. But when you read University Economics, one of the first lines that Alchian says in there is we're going to proceed our analysis, right, with the assumption that we have clearly defined and strictly enforced property rights. And then he proceeds to talk about the economic forces at work. When Israel Kirzner writes about how market processes work, he treats the framework as given. And he says, now we're going to study the spontaneous order inside of the framework. When Jim Buchanan writes, he treats the rules as up for grabs, but they're always going to be done before any action takes place. They get reconciled before any action can take place. There's a pre-reconciliation. His model actually draws directly on the Walrasian model. He has a fantastic essay called Ethical Rules in Large Numbers, and he says, we as human beings must treat the rules as parameters, not as variables. So he has a rule-taking model. He does model the rule-making process, but it's the same as like a Walrasian auctioneer would model it. So I want to suggest that all those approaches, while brilliant, they don't make up what we want to study, which is how it is that we get these rules in the first place. See, if you take the model correctly of individual choosing, and you have an open-ended nature of choice, the individual chooser enters into an institutional filter. That institutional filter has various different mechanisms which spit them out one way or another. That's because of the structure of incentives and the flow of information and the feedback mechanism that's involved. So that filter is going to be the main focus of our explanatory power. The equilibrium tendencies, right, are the outcomes of that. But what our focus of attention needs to be on is that institutional filter. So we either treat that institutional filter as given, or we treat the institutional filter as what has to come about. The research program in positive political economy of anarchism, all it's doing is looking at when we get endogenous rule formation in the absence of a geographic monopoly of coercion. How do I get that filter? So let me explain how this sort of came about. All right? The textbook model of socialist planning, material balance approach, or optimal planning, linear programming. Koncharovich won the Nobel Prize for development of linear programming approach. That argued that you could substitute production for direct use for production for exchange, and you could have a rationalization of the production process. And this runs into a reality of perverse incentives, okay, and lack of ability to mobilize the information that's required, and the inability to get the learning mechanism that's associated with profit and loss calculus. Socialist planning cannot work the way that the planners drew it up. But what did exist? Right? So there was this ideal of how the system was supposed to work, and then there's a reality about how the system actually worked in practice. So, as Professor Shima mentioned, my background when I started out was in studying the Soviet system. I wrote a book on the origins of the Soviet Union and why the system ran into the problems that it did. I then wrote a follow-up book on how the system collapsed. And the plan eventually was that I was going to do this series of papers on how the system operated under the sort of main period. I wrote a couple papers on that that were in public choice. But I never wrote the whole book on that, and instead I ended up by writing essays on transition because the economic history of Stalinism became less of a focus than how it is that you move from a centrally administered economy to a market economy. And so I started doing more papers on that. But in the process of studying how the Soviet system actually operated, and the reason why that was important for the transition is very simple. What is the transition? You're going from here to there. Right? That's what you're doing, here to there. So if you misidentify the start state, what most Western economists did, that's why they advocated things originally like, for example, Edgar Feige at University of University of Wisconsin, he argued that what you should do is, because no one owns anything in these economies, we can just take the sort of value of the whole economy, divide it up into shares, give it to all the citizens, and then the Coase theorem will operate, right? But the reality is that there was de facto ownership rights, all right? One of Professor Anderson's, I don't know if he was your teacher or a colleague, Yoram Barzel, he says one of the great victories of communism was to convince people, for the rulers to convince people that they didn't own what it is that they owned. They were the effective owners, right? So once you recognize that people have control rights but not cash flow rights, now all of a sudden the game of reform becomes totally different, because you're going to have to be able to give them the present value of their future income stream from the rent flows. Otherwise, they're going to fight like hell to make sure that they never give up that rent. And so the political economy of transition becomes totally different. So how did this system operate on these attenuated property rights structures? And for the Austrians in the crowd, Rothbard is brilliant on this. Rothbard in Man, Economy, and State understands this. He has a great line in there. He says, we overestimate the amount of socialism in Russia and underestimate the amount of socialism in New York City. Right? It's a great line that he has. And if you look at his analysis, I have a paper in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, one of the few that I published in there, but I have published in there. I have a paper in there on Rothbard and his contributions to post-Soviet and Soviet studies, because he really was a front runner on this. And if you also look at his discussion in Man, Economy, and State of public ownership, you'll see the same thing. So you can't public ownership. What does that mean? Someone has to have control rights. So how did the system really operate? So the way that the system operated was these ideas of a connection-based economy. It had to operate outside of official view. And so it was a connection-based society. I use the economic sociology concepts here of that markets operate on the strength of weak ties. Think of 6 degrees of separation. And it's a contract-based society. But socialist economies operated on the weakness of strong ties. So now you can start to see the kind of mechanism that I employed in my work, which was, how does the glue of this system stay together? It relied on connections and familiar relationships and extra-legal enforcement. What do we call that? It's mafia. Right? That's what we call it in the United States. But the interesting thing here is the mafia is not a phenomena of the post-communist transition. The mafia was part of the communist system. Right? That's in fact how those connections were enforced in the old days. Okay? And so it just evolves out of that. All right, so that's the first thing, is how is the system working? And note what I'm trying to say in here. I'm looking at these existing property rights, and I'm also seeing these familiar relationships, this connection-based economy. So it can't grow, but yet cooperation can appear outside of official view. Right? So if someone screws you in the black market, you can't go to the police and say, hey, protect me. Right? What were you doing, sir? Oh, I was doing something that's not allowed. Okay, well then you should be in prison. Right? So where did you get your enforcement of your contracts? Just to put this in magnitude, there's a study in the Economic Journal that came out in 1985 that estimated that in the early 1980s, 80, 81, 82, the amount of gasoline trafficking that took place in the black market in Moscow was 85% was purchased outside of the official market, market. It was purchased in the black market. So one of the things that black markets do in these Soviet-type economies was they serve to alleviate, to some extent, consumer dissatisfaction by eliminating, the queuing issue, all right, to some extent. And then the other thing they did was they allowed state managers to meet plan targets because they were able to engage to get resources reallocated in the plan failures. What else is going on here about this stuff that I got interested in? Well, here's another interesting puzzle. During the transition period, we went through a period where we said everything's about getting the prices right. If these economies are shortage economies, what we should do is we should allow the price to float to the market clearing level. It's all done. Okay? So, but then what happened was we got to a point where we're like, okay, well, how do I get that price to float to the market clearing level? Well, I actually have to establish private property rights. I got to, make sure that people honor contracts. I got to make sure that property is transferred by consent. Okay, that takes institutions. So then the rage became, get the institutions right. So for those of you who are old enough to remember it, 1989 to say 1992, get the prices right. Macro stabilization. Who were the big people everyone talked about? Olivia Blanchard coming over here. We got to get macro stabilization, right? I mean, these are, Delohe, that was when he was doing all that stuff. He was a macro guy. Jeffrey Sachs, when he did the Jump Start, right? Does everyone know how Jeffrey Sachs became famous economist? He was a young, punky kid like Mr. Hudick. And he was sitting at a fancy banquet at Harvard, and fancy banquets at Harvard happened to have princes and whatnot at them, and presidents of countries' sons, and the son of the president of Bolivia was there, and they were talking about Bolivia suffering from hyperinflation, it's horrible and everything, and Sachs, just like Dr. Hudick would do, says, I can fix that. And they said, what do you mean? He says, well, if you double the money supply, you're going to double the price level. Shut off the doubling of the money supply. And they said, really? You think you could fix that? And they arranged for him to fly down there. And he did what? He told them, turn the printing press off. And all of a sudden, Bolivia didn't have a hyperinflation. Everyone was like, Jeffrey Sachs is a hero. Which is, my favorite, story about Mises is related to that. During the hyperinflation in Austria, the central bankers came to him. Supposedly this is an apocryphal story probably. And they came to his office and they said, can you fix this? And he says, meet me here at midnight. And then they said, okay. So they came here at midnight. And he says, follow me. And then he took them to the, central bank and pointed to the, the printing press. And he says, turn it off. And, that was his advice or whatever. So, all right. So think about this. In these midst of these, time, everyone was thinking about, okay, get the stabilization, get the prices right. Then they were like, oh, well, now what we need to do is we need to have a rule of law. All right, both Ed and Joseph will remember, Wojciech Seppel, went all over the place, right, with the new Czech constitution. It was in a little pocket that he gave you. We were going to get a new constitution, and he came to George Mason University and taught in our law school and gave seminars and everything, and he was going to be the new constitutional lawyer. And we were going to get a constitution just, like that. And we were going to get, a legal system, and we're going to get contracts, and we're going to have bankruptcy legislation. We're going to have all this stuff. Institutions became the rage. And so then when they didn't happen, everyone said, oh, they lack institutional capacity. So you free market guys, you're crazy, because what we really need is government with strong capacity. So a phrase came about called, we need a strong minimal government, right? We need a strong but limited government, okay? Well, all right, so this raises this question of government capacity. But now what you have to think about, and this became a theme then of some of the stuff that's in, this is all, by the way, in the book that just came out, so you can buy the book and check and everything. And, the problem is the world of the second best and the issues of government. We don't live in the best of all possible worlds, and we're not picking saints to be our new government leaders. So it might actually be the case that the relevant alternative government structures that we would have in this early period of time would be worse than not having any state at all. All right, again, government capacity and the idea that we might be better off stateless. All right, so that sets up that. And then, so how is it that we can, so Professor Stringham here was my graduate student, and has gone on to develop his own career and very successful. And we all knew that that was going to happen. He probably doesn't think that we believed that at the time. But we used to try to challenge Ed all the time with his work, because what he was working on and what he had brought to George Mason before he even showed up there, he brought with him, was a series of studies on market-provided law. In particular, a fascination with the New York Stock Exchange. And what Ed then got involved in, credit card industry. And then what Ed got involved with was explaining Amsterdam and the rise of the first sort of stock market. And Ed did a great job on, that and great history. And the question, when we were trying to poke Ed to make him go further was, okay, Ed, you've demonstrated that we can get the rules of complicated financial exchange to evolve. But why is it that all these stock exchanges get taken over by the state at some point, or the shadow of the state kind of argument? So we can demonstrate that we can rely on endogenous processes to get the thing off the ground, but can we rely on endogenous processes to transition it from the beginning states of it to the advanced state of it is, let's say, like the New York Stock Exchange today? Or do we not need more government intervention to do that? And that was a challenge. That's not a criticism. It's a, hey, how would that mechanism work? Right? That's what we were trying to prod him to think in terms of and go forward on. And so it's this issue of how is it that we want to have a social order which is not just among small groups? Now, why did that become a fascination? Because in the technical literature of self-enforcement in economics, the proof was that reputation could serve to discipline repeat dealings, right? If the actors existed in small groups of homogeneous agents with really low discount rates. So imagine what that world is, okay? It would be like a small Hasidic community. And if you think about a lot of the studies that were done on self-governance before Ed started his research, so not the Wild Wild West stuff, but the stuff that like Lisa Bernstein, right? That was small communities. Or, Janet Landa, right? Ethnically homogeneous middlemen, right? And so what became the sort of focus of our group, starting with Ed, was to study situations of large groups of heterogeneous agents, sometimes with high discount rates. That's why we study pirates and criminals like prison gangs, not because we like pirates. Pete Leeson likes pirates, right? But it's not because we like pirates. The first piratologist out of our group was Virgil Storr, right? He was there before Pete. He studied, that was his original thing. And the idea was they're high discount rate people, right? Just like prison gangs would be high discount people, and yet we see them cooperating in ways that generate social cooperation. Why would I pick people that are the opposite of what the standard model shows? On the one hand, it shows that your results are more robust than you otherwise would imagine them to be. But it's also the case that it's a bigger issue having to do with growth and development. What we need to do is recognize that we benefit from interacting with strangers. This is actually on my next slide. The point, I guess, that I want you to take away from on this slide would be that these institutions that we're looking at have to have mechanisms that limit access, assign accountability, and punish deviations. Okay? So the institutions, in order for them to work to elicit cooperation among heterogeneous agents, are going to have to limit access, assign accountability, and punish the ones who violate the rules. Okay? Institutional diversity throughout the world, but in form, that people can call it all kinds of different things, but their function serves a similar goal. All right? So we want to cooperate with strangers. Okay? We want to have cooperation among anonymous types, not just cooperation among our small group. Both because that tests the strength of our mechanism, and it also, we realize the social gains from cooperation under the division of labor. In the previous slide, in the paper that I have, I use the example of Adam Smith talking about the common woolen coat in the beginning of The Wealth of Nations. He says to you, the reader, that imagine all of the exchanges that must take place to produce even the common woolen coat on the day laborer's back. Those number of exchanges far exceed our ability to compute. He also argues that the number of exchange relationships that we rely on for our very survival as human beings, because nature is red in tooth and claw, so the only way that we can survive is in fact cooperating with one another. And for our daily survival, we rely on the cooperations of great multitudes, where in our lifetime we have but the opportunity to make but a few close friends. So we can't rely on benevolence. But note what's cool about Smith's example. There's no government that's controlling international trade at the time Smith is talking. And yet when he goes through his example of the social cooperation and division of labor to produce a common woolen coat, he gets goods from all over the world. That's his thought experiment. Because remember, one of the things that you don't know how to make is the ship that brings the dyes from over to be able to get the, So there's a vast amount of international division of labor that he's tying into, and that somehow is cooperated without anyone enforcing the relationships. So Smith from the get-go gets this point, but obviously they don't run with it the way that I'm trying to push you to run with it. Milton Friedman, in probably the most effective book in the United States, in Is Free to Choose, he holds up a pencil. Tell me when 10 minutes left? Okay. All right. For the whole thing? Okay. All right. Terry, I apologize. I'm like a wind-up doll. I'll get done. Friedman holds up a pencil and says, none of you know how to make this pencil. Right? None of you know how to make a pencil. And again, he goes around the world in the thought experiment. So here's the problem. I'll leave for the discussions tomorrow and maybe afterwards. My paper, what I do is I try to juxtapose normative anarchism, which focuses on the logic of non-aggression and questions of justice and desirability, with positive political economy of anarchism. And I argue that it's an evangelical plea to the students out there that what I want you to do is ignore reading Ethics of Liberty, right, and read The Enterprise of Law. Like if you face a trade-off in your time, all right, Enterprise of Law, ethics of liberty, read enterprise of law. That's my plea to you. That's to say it in an obnoxious way. If it was For a New Liberty, by the way, I might tell you read For a New Liberty rather than that, because he tries to explicate mechanisms in For a New Liberty, like, for example, with the insurance industry or stuff. But ethics of liberty, right? Or this. So I would say, we got to read these kind of issues. So what is it that we're trying to get at? The positive political economy of anarchism has to come to grips with this paradox of social distance. The more social and geographic distance people are from us, the more we can learn from them. But the more distant they are from us, the less likely we can trust them. So we feel vulnerable in interacting with them. So how do I bridge that gap? It can't be a small group setting of homogeneous agents with low discount rates. If that's the only people I interact with, I'm not going to get much. I won't have that scarf. I'll be in a mud hut, right? There's a great book called The Art of Not Being Governed by James Scott. He talks about how it is people try to escape modern totalitarian governments. And they do. And it's a great book. Ed has a piece that's coming out in this, everything like that. But where do they escape to, Ed? The mountains. They live like a commune, right? It was small, homogeneous groups. They don't trust anyone. And you know what? They don't have nice blue and red scarves. They probably don't even have shampoo, right? They're just sort of hanging out in nature. All right. So we want to realize the benefits of modern society, but yet recognize the cost. How do we do that? And how do we do it without the state? That's what the positive political economy idea is. And so what you have to focus on is how is it that you get that bridge? And that's what guys like Stringham and Leeson have done. Now, the way Ed does this, and I'll let him, because he's going to talk tomorrow about a paper that he's working on, but it'll be around here. What Ed is mainly focused on is mechanisms of exclusion. He has a brilliant idea, which is that you don't want ex post punishment, because that's costly, compared to if I could eliminate the people who are going to screw me before they screw me. Right? And so Ed talks about mechanisms that have happened throughout history to exclude cheaters in the social game before they have the possibility to cheat. And how is it that I find those cheaters? In the old days, there was a great paper by Bob Frank in the AER called If Homo economicus Could Choose His Own Utility Function, Would He Choose One with a Conscience? And Frank's argument is yes, because we would have more trading partners. Because the fact is that if I have a conscience, if I cheat you, I'm going to blush, or I'm going to do something that signals that I'm a cheater. This is your exclusion mechanism. What you don't want to do is you don't want to play poker, right, with someone who has a complete poker face, meaning, they don't, no Lady Gaga reference there, just the old reference, poker faces about, that you can't tell what is going on with them. Leeson does the opposite. He's trying to do mechanisms of inclusion. So the way I like to think about it is imagine a social sieve. And one, you have to squeeze yourself through the holes. The other one, you put people in and only the residue remain. Stringham talks about everyone going in and only the residue remain. That's his trading clubs. Leeson is talking about how is it that I get myself into that trading club. All right? In both cases, they're examining how you realize the social gains from cooperation. I realize I'm running out of time, so let me just get to my conclusion. Okay? So why is this contemporary relevance of this positive political economy of anarchism? And why it is that I think all of you guys should get excited about it and start reading these works and developing and working on it. It's not just about transition, developing, and war-torn economies, though those are very important. As we speak, we're tearing apart another economy with war. What's going to happen when it's over? It's going to have to rebuild. And it can't rely on the government to rebuild it. That's one of the main conclusions of my colleague Chris Coyne's wonderful book called After War. 75% of U.S. efforts in the 20th century to generate democracy in the market through after-war strategies, 75% of them today, those countries are at lower on the polity index than modern-day Iran. That's a 4 This is a complete disaster of foreign policy. All right, so it's not just tradition and developing, though those are important. But what's being brought about by the fiscal crisis in Western Europe and in the United States? We cannot rely on government anymore because government is what got us into the problem in the first place. And we're going to have to open questions of scale and scope when we re-examine. If you want to fix the problem in Wisconsin, it's not just a Band-Aid. You have to ask, what is actually the role of government? What is the role in education? What is government's role in health and human services? What is government's role, right? If you reduce the scope of government, you reduce the problem that's involved. And The Economist magazine this week, which I suggest you all go out and get after you buy my book, it's very cheap. Only a couple crowns, go buy them, lots of them. And, The Economist magazine, what it refers to is it says that this problem of addressing the scale and scope of government is the great political issue of our times. Old fogies like me, right, our great issue was, the collapse of communism. For you young people out there, this is your issue. Get excited about it, sink your teeth into it, and make the most out of it, because the future really, is in your hands on whether or not we're going to be able to scale back government and restrict its scope, because our current path is simply unsustainable as a fiscal state. Thank you very much. I'm able to
Professor Boettke, we are not running out of time completely, so I guess we have time for 2 or 3 questions and short answers or comments. So now the floor is open for questions. Raise your hand. The mic is coming to you.
I'm Vít Jedlička. I'm studying here on this school, and I would like to ask Mr. Boettke, so do you think really that a limited state is oxymoron in a way? That it's in fact something which is not achievable, and that it's only an illusion in a way, and that maybe anarchism would be the best way to go for the society?
Thank you. Easy. You have 2 minutes.
2 minutes, yeah. I think that in response to this Economist magazine article, I wrote up a little thing and I just said, it seems like we're going to move into the age of Jim Buchanan. Now, Ed's think he's just had sour milk. But why do I think that? It's because Buchanan puts the puzzle to us of dividing the state up into a protective state, a productive state, and a redistributive state. And the puzzle for Buchanan is, can I empower the protective and the productive state without unleashing the redistributive state? And the answer that is given in this Economist magazine is no. But we first have to recognize Buchanan's effort at constraining it. And out of that recognition will come the idea that we have to give greater scope for market-generated self-enforcement and civil society. Not all good things in life are delivered through the market, right? The market's very vital. It's like we had a hurricane back in Virginia about 5 years ago, and I went to the Home Depot, the next morning, and they already had water and generators and everything like that. And I called my wife on the cell phone, and I said, "I love capitalism." I screamed out. She's like, people around me looking. And not only did they have the displays of those stuff, but they had them all nicely displayed. Markets are amazing things, but markets don't do everything, but civil society can. Right? A lot of civil society organizations can. So in The Economist magazine, they quote a thing at the end, which is a Chinese woman who won this award, and she says, we're transitioning from a big state to a small state, and from a small society to a big society. And I think that's also going to be on the table. So Buchanan, recognition that it's markets and civil society, reduce the state. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions? I'm sure there are questions. Yeah, 1 and 2.
Good afternoon, Professor Boettke. My question is, we have experience with transition process in the Central Europe, and we all know that civil society is the key requirement for the stability in the region. But the question is, how the government should create some conditions for the evolution of civil society, if there is any possibility to somehow coordinate the emergence of civil institutions, or if it's better way to abolish all the governmental agencies at all. So my question is, what is your opinion? What is your suggestion from the perspective of anarchism research?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I should point out is that I told this to Joseph the other day. I was involved with a Smithsonian study group that focused on the rise of civil society in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union throughout all of the 1990s. And at the end of that 10-year period of study, one thing that we found is no one really knows what social capital is, and people have a difficult time talking about civil society. The other thing that we found out, and I think this is extremely important, is government-led efforts to create civil society, all they did was create a rent race for people to have institutions that supposedly represent civil society. Real civil society comes bottom up. It comes out of the natural interest of individuals. When Tocqueville, unlike Putnam, when Tocqueville looked at America, the reason why he found America so fascinating was because we didn't pay attention to politicians, but we cared passionately about our bridge club. Right? What we cared about was our local communities and our interest in those things and the clubs that's involved. That's the source of civil society. Right? Your lodge and blah, 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 and all these other kinds of things that would be local, rather than the idea that I'm going to create institutions of democracy from on top. So it's all about bubbling up from the bottom rather than imposing from on top. And so you ask the question, what can government do? I would say the best thing a government can do is get out of the way. Now, let me just say one last thing on this, because one of the problems with the welfare state is, if you read someone like an older historian, Gertrude Himmelfarb, writing about the welfare state when it was under civil society and very limited government, but they still had some government, like in England or whatever, she always talks about the idea of how they had to have some mechanism to sort out the worthy poor from the unworthy poor. Because you really do want to help the worthy poor, but what you can't do is allow the unworthy poor to sacrifice your abilities to fix the problems with the worthy poor. And one of the problems with the modern systems of the welfare system is that's been lost. And it's also what Buchanan calls a Samaritan's dilemma, which is that there's an incentive for the endogenous creation of people who are going to be in need of welfare because of the way that we're setting up the system. And that's part of the reason why the fiscal system is so strained, and why it is that we're in the crisis of legitimacy in these governments that we have right now.
And we have time for one last comment or question. Pavel.
Pavel Minarik, University of Economics. Talking about these endogenous rules, do you think this capacity for creating good institutions is universal, or there's some, say, cultural precondition? I think in terms of religion, because the societies are not tabula rasa, they have their historical experience and so on.
Yeah, so I've been, in the paper I take some shots at normative arguments and, morality, because I want to sort of push the argument about absolute economics being absolute ethics. But I really don't believe that. That's just, like I'm pushing that line of argument. Because ultimately, you're going to have rules of just conduct and some moral basis, which lowers the transaction costs of enforcing these sort of institutions that are not, you can't generate order at the point of a gun, right? And so if there's no guns, so the way to put it is a free society works best when the need for a policeman is least, right? On the other hand, it's also true that, an armed society is a friendly society. So how is it that we, juxtapose these things so that we end up by getting the idea that what we want to have is a self-ordering mechanism that realizes the social gains from cooperation with the minimizing predation. And we're going to need to have, there's going to have to be some shared, what we call common knowledge, shared common knowledge about what is the just thing to do, what's morality and things like that. So we need philosophers very much so. One of the best lines from Hayek is, an economist who's only an economist is, very dangerous. I always add to that in my classes, an economist who knows only economics is, very dangerous to society, is the most dangerous person to society, except perhaps a moral philosopher who knows no economics. But an economist that doesn't know any moral philosophy is very dangerous. And so what we need to do is, that lowers the transaction. So religion, as a carrier of culture, plays an extremely important role. Now, do I believe that that means that some nations are going to be more likely to be able to be more flexible in this than others? I think there's enough of a universal idea of what morality is, right? Like the notions of property, contract, and consent, which Hume talks about in the Treatise on Human Nature. Those are not things unique to just Western culture. They might take on institutional diversity, but they all serve this function of defining mine and thine and, making people keep promises and respecting the transference by consent. And so that's, I think, what the hope is. But there's definitely this interaction between morality and the rules of the game. So, good question.
And a very good answer. Thank you very much. We are just following our schedule. Now a short break, and we get all ready for the second highlight of this afternoon.